So hello historians, today we are going to unpack Cold War, alright, which is an important part of both the O-level as well as the N-level examinations. So when we talk about Cold War, we're going to unpack what was Cold War, we're going to see how did Cold War started, and we are going to look at why is Cold War so important. Okay, so what was Cold War? All right, this is a definition, a very generic definition that if you Google or if you look at your textbook, this would be an actual definition of Cold War. All right, so the key words here is a Cold War happens when nations have very tense relations. There is definitely very fierce fighting, and this is of course in contrast to hot war. And of course, we're talking about the basic part that the two countries compete with each other in many areas. And basically, Cold War sometimes can be defined as an ideological war. All right, the manifestation starts from being different in how they look at the political, the economic, as well as the social aspect. So Cold War is literally an era of confrontation and competition between, of course, the two superpowers that were the strongest after World War II. Okay, you have the US as well as the Soviet Union, and the basis of their ideology, which is democracy as well as communism. And because of that, as well as the very fact that these two superpowers later on had a lot of weapons, specifically nuclear weapons, the period of Cold War was actually very intense. Now, how did Cold War start? Okay, we take a look at what happened after World War II, and if you look at the pictures on the right, you would see that the end of war was actually quite happy. You know, people were excited, people were very jubilant because the war literally destroyed a lot of Europe. Okay, and in this picture you can see that one of the German generals actually surrendered to the Americans. Okay, and you can see that these are more pictures of when the war is over. All right, and the Nazis surrendered, and if you look at this picture at the bottom, it's actually in France. So at the height of Germans' strength, you can see that German expanded all the way to capture France, to capture Norway, as well as parts of Italy, and carried on to conquer Poland as well as Soviet territory. Now, please don't forget that we also have the other front of war, which is war in Asia Pacific. And looking at this particular map, you can see that Japan actually has conquered most parts of China, all right, and expanded all the way to the Philippines and Southeast Asia. Now, Japan surrendered definitely because of a lot of factors, but one of the most important factor would definitely be the atomic bomb. All right, and here you can see that the Japanese were waiting to actually sign their surrender papers. So at the end of World War II, you would have the big three. All right, you will have Soviet Union, Britain, and USA. However, Britain wasn't in the best form because they had to actually rebuild their country after being heavily bombed and heavily destroyed after World War II. Okay, and this is a simple infograph to show the alliance. Now, pay attention to the very fact that USSR is together with USA. All right, now if the relationship between both of them was actually very cordial, that means very good during World War II, then what happened? Now moving on, we're going to look at specific reasons for Cold War. Altogether, there are 3 reasons for Cold War. And as we are looking at the reasons, do refer to this timeline. There is a link below, and you can actually just access to this particular timeline. Now, the first reason for Cold War is definitely ideology. It is the differences that actually lead to the conflict. And you can safely say that the conflict actually started even before World War II, all right, when Russia turned communist. Specifically, USA actually intervened in the Russian Civil War, and the tension has already accumulated since then. All right, the Russian Civil War was during this period, and specifically America decided to intervene because they felt that if they allowed communism to spread to the entire Europe, it would actually jeopardize America's interest in Europe. Now, do understand that when we look at ideology, you need to know the differences between both communism, democracy, as well as capitalism. All right. Now, this particular definition, all right, is needed specifically when we are looking at ideology. So that means when you write an essay, you need specific examples like this, all right, to actually highlight to the examiner what is the difference between a capitalist / democratic country as well as a communist country. Now, moving on, Soviet Union was not allowed to actually join League of Nations. And if you have remembered the history about League of Nations, it is an international organization. All right, and again, it was because the difference in ideology between Soviet Union and the rest of the world. Okay. However, in 1933, as Japan grew more aggressive and left League of Nations, all right, Soviet Union was allowed to join the League of Nations because both Germany and Japan withdrew. All right, so you feel that there is already tension brewing, that the very fact that even other countries apart from America were actually only going to recognize Soviet Union because they need to. So they had always this agenda, and if you were Soviet Union, I'm very sure you felt very strained and you felt very suspicious about the actions and motivation of other people. So for ideological conflict, all right, in the set of notes that is also in the link given, all right, always start with definition if you're stuck. Okay, remember that the examples can be seen. All right, you can actually either quote examples about differences in ideology or examples of how America and the rest of the world actually always had this impression of Soviet Union. You can even say that it's a very negative impression, or a very biased impression, just because of the differences in ideology. And how does ideology conflict actually lead to Cold War? All right, it is because of the fear, the suspicion caused by the differing ideologies, and it led to even the worsening of relations. So always remember the fact about when you make the link, it is always about answering the question. Okay. Now let's go to reason 2, and reason 2 is actually about mistrust. Okay, and in mistrust, it can be seen as in different or a variety of ways. You can actually quote evidences from before World War II start. It can also be during World War II, and it can be during the post-World War II. All right, so it depends on the question, it depends on the year, it can also depend on the timeline. So be very careful when you read questions. All right, now moving on. Okay, even though Soviet Union actually joined League of Nations, there was always this apprehensiveness against Soviet Union. Okay, and if you remembered appeasement, and if you remembered the Munich Conference of 1938, okay, Britain and France decided to appease Hitler to prevent Hitler from actually taking more land or being more aggressive. Okay, and in this particular conference or meeting, Soviet Union was not invited because the world, and especially Britain as well as League of Nations, they trusted Hitler more in comparison to Stalin. And in this particular cartoon, you can see that, you know, the rest of the world was meeting, but Stalin was left out of this. All right, so this is an example of mistrust before World War II. Now, we also know that World War II started when Hitler invaded Poland. And we also know that appeasement actually failed. All right. Now, Hitler did not want to negotiate. Hitler always wanted expansion. But for Hitler to expand into the rest of Europe, Hitler needed the help of Soviet Union. So it's such an irony that while Hitler actually signed an agreement with Britain and France in the Munich appeasement, Britain and France did not realize that Hitler actually had his own agenda, and he signed the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact with Stalin. Okay, and it literally made Soviet Union public enemy number one, and Soviet Union was actually expelled from League of Nations because of this action. Now, as the war started, you also realized that, you know, Hitler had always wanted to carry on expansion towards Poland as well as Soviet Union. Okay, now 2 years later, Hitler invaded Soviet Union and Stalin changed sides and allied with USA and Britain. All right, now this made other powers suspicious of Soviet. Whose side was Soviet on? So it was really very hard to convince people who already knew that Stalin and Soviet Union joined Hitler, and when they were being attacked on ambush, they changed sides. So there is always this mistrust towards Soviet Union due to their actions. Now, another example of mistrust during World War II was definitely the Second War Front. All right. So now just imagine that Soviet Union is together with the Allied forces, which is actually USA, Britain, as well as France. Okay. Now the war continued, and Soviet forces were pushing Germany back to Britain. All right. It was unfortunate that the Second War Front was actually delayed. Okay, US actually took about a year and a half about that to open the Second War Front, and Stalin became very much suspicious of this. Okay, Stalin was feeling that the Allied powers, and especially USA, refused to actually send help because they have always had this deep suspicion towards Soviet Union. So they delay help so that Soviet Union forces would actually be weakened. Now, why did the Allies actually delay opening up the Second War Front? Was it really on purpose? Okay. Now, the Allies delayed because they wanted to ensure the highest likelihood of success. Okay, and minimize the loss of men, the loss of resources. But of course, if you were Stalin, you would see this as a ploy or as a tactic to weaken Soviet Union. So there were trust issues definitely. And if you look very carefully at this particular cartoon, Stalin was here. This is a newspaper of sorts or a memo, and it says to our Western allies, Second Front now, but it did not happen. Now, Soviet Union and USA both entered the war specifically in these 2 months, okay, and they did work closely with Britain to fight Germany. So you can actually see that their alliance was actually not strong from the beginning, and it was really because of the necessity. They had a common enemy, and their common enemy was, of course, Germany. All right, so now we have come to the period where it gets a little bit more political, a bit more intense. War was coming to an end. It was a sure thing that Germany would lose because America was in the game. You also had the strength of Soviet Union. Britain was not giving up. So these 3 countries decided to meet in February 1945 in Yalta. And we call it the Yalta Conference. Conferences is actually meetings or discussion. Now, all these three countries actually had different goals, but they needed to compromise because one, you must remember, war has not ended. War actually officially ended in May. Okay, but why did they have to meet in February 1945? And the reason is simply because they need to make sure that if Germany were to actually surrender, what would be the next course of action? We're talking about Germany. It's a big country. You know, they literally invaded the whole entire of Europe. So what would we do? Okay, so it's just to make sure that they have plans. So when World War II ended in May, specifically May 1945, they met again in July 1945, but the environment and as well as the people were actually specifically different. Okay, at this time, USA had successfully created a bomb, and they may not even need Soviet help to actually fight Japan. All right, and USA did tell Soviet about the bomb. Okay, so this was Yalta Conference, the first time that they met. So you look at the leaders, you had Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin. And these were the terms of the Yalta Conference. You can pause the video. You can actually even go to this link. I will put the link below the video. All right, and you can see specifically that there were things that they need to discuss. They need to discuss about Berlin. They need to discuss about what will happen to Eastern Europe, because right now Soviet Union has gone all the way into Eastern Europe, specifically even into Germany to stop the Germans. Okay, and they also decided what to do with Japan. All right, so a lot of the discussions on what to do after Germany surrendered were discussed at Yalta. But when war is over and the leaders were different, so if you look specifically at Potsdam, less than 6 months, okay, you have Britain, Clement Attlee, you have USA Truman, and you have the constant one, which is actually Stalin, all right, from Soviet Union. But if you look at this blue box, okay, Roosevelt passed away, and Roosevelt had been quite willing to work and give in to Stalin, but Truman is slightly different. Truman made little secret of his dislike for communism as well as Stalin personally. So you can already feel the tension between these two countries, between Truman as well as Stalin. And would relationship between USA and USSR be affected with a change of leader? Of course, Truman was very pragmatic, and he was a firm believer towards going against communism. All right, you can pause the video. You can read a little bit about Truman. Now, moving on, as they met at Potsdam, you can actually see there are differences. Okay, initially, Stalin promised that Stalin would actually give free elections to countries in the Eastern Europe. But 6 months later, you could actually see that Stalin was very hesitant to give up his hold or his control over Eastern Europe. So this also panicked the Allied powers and especially USA. All right, there was also arguments starting about what to do with Germany, all right, and how much Germany needed to pay after World War II. So the tension has already started. So all this tension will later on lead to, of course, suspicion, mistrust, and eventually the beginning of Cold War. Now, of course, things worsened just now, as we were saying, that it didn't help that America actually was hiding the very fact that they actually have started this Manhattan Project, which is actually a nuclear weapon initiative actually. And Stalin, even though Stalin faked that Stalin didn't know, but actually he already knew because he already had a group of spies. And Stalin's reaction, well, we have to speed things up. And it was actually about them, Soviet Union, trying to make sure that they also have access to creating a superpower, a super weapon, which is the atomic bomb. So you can see that the relationship, even during the post-war, even during the war itself, and moving on to post-war, they've always had these great suspicions towards each other. And of course, it didn't help that the destruction that they saw in Japan made them question each other. All right, so Soviet Union questioned America's motive, and America questioned Soviet Union's motive, as well as the aspirations of Soviet. Okay, what is it that they want to do? So for mistrust, all right, as what I said just now, there are examples that is before the war, examples of mistrust during the war, and examples of post-war in Europe. Now, moving on, so if you were to make that link, how does mistrust lead to Cold War? Mistrust led to Cold War because of the weak alliance from the beginning, and it worsened the relationship. Now, moving on, reason number 3, worsen relationship, and we are looking at specific time period, which is actually post-war period. All right, what is the relationship between America as well as Soviet Union? Okay, there are superpowers. You cannot deny that whatever they do will shape how Europe will be. Okay, and specifically, a lot of things happen. All right, there was a speech by Stalin specifically. There were also very interesting letters or telegram from the US ambassador to Soviet Union, when we can actually see that that will be the period where relationship really soured or really went south. Okay, and there was a speech by Churchill, which was the previous British Prime Minister, about the Iron Curtain, as well as the Soviet ambassador to USA when he acknowledged that the tensions are very real. All right, now this was how Europe looked like. So technically, the only two superpowers that you can find is actually USA and Soviet Union. And it didn't also help that Soviet was taking over Eastern Europe. All right, there were a lot of Soviet army occupying Eastern Europe. Stalin under Potsdam was actually supposed to give all these countries back their freedom, but it did not happen. Okay, and the reason is because Stalin wanted to create a buffer zone between Soviet Union and Western Europe. So you can see that starting from after the war, actually 1945 all the way to 1948, Stalin was actually quite aggressive and took a lot of the Eastern European states and were not willing to give it. Okay, and if you look at the map specifically, the darker red here represents, of course, Soviet Union itself, whereas all these areas were actually areas that we call them the satellite states or Stalin-sponsored or communist-sponsored states. So you can physically see that, what Stalin was doing is, dropping the Iron Curtain. And Iron Curtain is a figure of speech to actually show that there are two different areas, two different sections, okay? And his speech that says that there will always be conflict between communism and democracy did not help the relationship between America as well as Soviet Union. Okay, and this is of course George Kennan. He was a US diplomat and ambassador, and in his letter to Truman, actually to the American president, he said this. Okay, he said that the Russians wanted to spread communism and US should use diplomatic, economic and military actions to keep communism contained. So he was asking the president to take greater actions towards communists as well as Soviet Union. So this is Kennan, all right, and he says that there is no need to go to war, but there must be actions, and the actions must be long-term, must be firm, and must be vigilant. Okay, the Iron Curtain speech of 1946 was literally telling the world that, Europe now is divided into two. And it was such an irony that the Allies had spent 6 years fighting for freedom, but now they are fighting against communist or Soviet dictatorship. So this particular speech was actually quite strong worded, and it made a lot of people stand up, and they were thinking like, what is the next course of action? How are they going to handle this communist power? The Soviet ambassador to USA also wrote in a telegram, and he says that the US had emerged stronger and hence Soviet need to secure a buffer zone to protect itself. Okay, so having this pressure of a very dominant communist, a very dominant Soviet Union, what was America's reaction? Okay, and it didn't help that specifically the communist parties were actually very strong, and there was this incident in Greece as well as Turkey where it was a civil war. A civil war is fighting within the country, but there were in this particular civil war, it was also sponsored by the communists, and Britain as well as America had to actually help the non-communist leaders or the non-communist party in Greece and Turkey to sort of fight back this communist influence. So they felt really threatened. All right, and if you were Truman, and you are the president of the strongest country in the world right now, what would you do? Okay, so he came up with this Truman Doctrine, and it is actually a foreign policy initiative that would protect democracies around the world. Okay, and the idea is for United States to actually support anyone who didn't believe in communism. Because there is always this fear about this domino theory, right? When one country became communist, another country will follow suit, and they didn't want that. Right? They didn't want this. Imagine if, let's say, Soviet Union and Stalin was an octopus. They didn't want this world domination. So Truman Doctrine is a pledge that US would fight communism worldwide, anywhere around the world. So you can see that this particular picture, American tanks provided by Truman Doctrine in Turkey. Okay. They also give aid. Specifically, later on, you will see about the Marshall Plan money. Okay, and the idea is that it is important to ensure that Europe, especially Europe, actually would recover fast so that they do not get attracted to the idea of communism. Okay, so what is this Marshall Plan? It is actually billions of dollars into Western Europe for food and supplies. Okay, and this is of course George Marshall. All right, and in his plan, it is definitely just more money to rebuild countries. About 400 million to help countries like Greece and Turkey. Okay, and Marshall Plan actually worked. All right, a lot of countries who received the money and the aid actually saw a very fast recovery in comparison to countries that did not receive the Marshall Aid or the Marshall Plan. So money helps. All right, this is a very fast, quick look. All right, at which were the countries that received the least Marshall Aid and which were the countries that received the most. Now, is there a difference between a doctrine, the Truman Doctrine specifically, as well as containment? The Truman Doctrine was to support, okay, any non-communist nation, whereas containment is designed to stop communism. Okay, so Truman Doctrine is the bigger umbrella. It is really to support any communist nation, whereas containment is in the event that there is already communist influence in that country, what is the next course of action? Okay, it can be military, or it can also be economic strategy. Okay, so moving on. All right, the doctrine is an idea. All right, introduction of both the Truman Doctrine as well as the Marshall Plan. Okay, now what was Soviet response to all this? And if you look very carefully at the cartoon, you can see that Stalin here is choking on the communist pipe. Okay, so obviously the response was actually very bad, very negative. All right, and they decided specifically with all this plan, communist Soviet Union needed to respond. Okay, so they set up this Cominform, which is Communist Info Bureau, and the objective is to unite all communist countries. They do also give aid, economic aid, and you'll see in a short while. Okay, later on, the second confrontation, which is in the Berlin blockade, will be elaborated. Okay, but I want you to focus on the 1949 part here. All right, so just now, like I said, if USA actually had the Marshall Plan, Soviet Union had the Comecon. Okay, and because of the confrontation in Berlin, Soviet Union's direct confrontation, right? If you remember about Berlin blockade, USA set up this NATO, and NATO stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Okay, and it is really basically to make sure that in the event that there is another military attack by Soviet Union, USA would back European powers up through this particular organization. All right, and it didn't really help that Soviet 2 years after America actually dropped the bomb in Japan, they also developed their own atomic bomb. Okay, so this was a response. And in 1955, Soviet also had their own military alliance. That means in the event that any communist countries actually were to get entangled with non-communist countries as well as USA, Soviet Union would gladly help them. Okay, so how the two superpowers responded, you can find that in politics what they do, in economics what they do, in military what they do. Okay, so for worsening relationship, you could see that there are many examples. You have to choose wisely. You have to remember what is needed. Okay, and specifically definition is, so how does worsening relations lead to Cold War? There has always been competition, and this competition basically leads to the tension. Okay, so in summary, the reasons for Cold War, it is ideological, it is mistrust, and it is of course the worsening relations after the war. Okay, so Cold War was a period of tension, mistrust, and rivalry. Okay, remember, it is basically like a Jenga game like that. You know, you have to pull out the pieces and see which competitor or whether your opponent actually will collapse your Jenga. Okay, so we'll end here and we will continue in the other Cold War videos. So thank you very much, historians. Bye bye.